This is Lecture 1 of Psychology 230, Introduction to Brain and Behavior, and it corresponds to Chapter 1 of your textbook.
And Chapter 1 was about the basics. So what is psychobiology? It's the study of the biological basis of emotion, cognition, and behavior. So essentially the biological basis of psychology. And I assume that most of you are interested, at least somewhat interested in psychology of the brain if you're taking these courses. But why study the brain? Because there are a lot of unanswered questions regarding the brain. We don't actually know that much about the brain, considering how much time and effort we've spent researching the brain. So scientists have only recently mapped the nervous system, or the entire brain and the rest of the nervous system of this C. elegans roundworm, which is a pretty small and simple organism. It only has 302 neurons and over 7,000 connections between the neurons. So it's a relatively small neural system, and only recently have we mapped this. Humans, on the other hand, have about 86 billion neurons with trillions of connections, indicating that we're quite a long way from understanding the complexity of the human brain. If you're interested in C. elegans and in this map that scientists have recently created, there's a website right here. So I'll refer a lot of times to websites and additional information in the lecture. You're not going to be responsible for that information, it's just if you're interested. And why study the brain as well? There are practical reasons. Many medical and psychological disorders originate in the brain. So for example, I study schizophrenia, and a big part of schizophrenia is observable changes that happen in the brain, dysregulation of dopamine, decreases in the volume of certain areas in the brain. And so we can learn a lot about treatments and causes of medical and psychological disorders by studying the brain. The nervous system is broken into a couple parts. There's the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is what you think of, I think, when most people think of psychobiology or neuroscience. It's the brain and the spinal cord. And the spinal cord connects the brain to the rest of the body. In the peripheral nervous system, the periphery being like the outside part, right? So it's outside of the central nervous system. The nerves and this includes the nerves and the neuronal processes outside of the brain and spinal cord, and it's comprised of sensory and motor connections to and from the central nervous system. So it takes information from the body like touch, it takes information from the body like touch, brings it up to the central nervous system, and then the central nervous system sends that information to complete actions. A neuron is a nerve cell within the body, within the nervous system, and neurons communicate with each other, and we're going to cover a lot of that in the second chapter. The cerebrum, which is also called the forebrain, is the main part of the brain. It's what you're used to seeing when you look at the picture of the brain, and it's responsible for most of our conscious thoughts. So it's responsible for these higher level functions. The brainstem is the lower center part of the brain, if you can see in this middle picture, this color part in the middle picture, and it includes the pons, medulla, midbrain, and diencephalon. Some people include the cerebellum in the brainstem, but this is more typically considered to be a separate component. So the brainstem is kind of like the old part of the brain. People call it like the reptilian part of the brain, meaning like it's, in terms of evolution, it was one of the first parts of the brain to evolve, so it's responsible for a lot of basic functions. And then the cerebellum, which actually means like a little cerebrum. It looks like a tiny brain stuck in the back of the neck, and this plays a big part in learning and coordinating movements, has many connections with the cerebrum, and the cerebellum is actually a really interesting part of the brain. We're going to cover it a bit more in a later section, but we're finding out more and more that it plays a role in higher cognitive and emotional functions. Before, we often just considered it to be mostly responsible for movement, but we're learning that it's a little more complex than that. Section 2, Historical Perspectives on Brain and Behavior. Neuroscience and psychobiology have a long history in philosophy. So before people were really studying the brain, they were studying the brain directly necessarily. Before we had MRI and all these other neuroimaging techniques, philosophers like Aristotle were coming up with ideas of how they thought the brain and behavior connect. So Aristotle ascribed to a school of thought called mentalism, and he believed that the psyche, which is essentially there was a psyche, which is essentially the idea of the mind, an untouchable, intangible entity that's responsible for conscious awareness and cognition. And mentalism is the idea that the mind is responsible for behavior, which to us is really, most people would consider that to be obvious now, but back in Aristotle's time that was not a given. It was a newer idea. Then many years later, Descartes, who was considered kind of the father of modern philosophy, came up with dualism. And dualism is the idea that the mind and the body are actually separate entities. So Descartes believed that the mind and the body interact through the pineal gland, which we now know is not correct. But he believed that there was a separate physical brain and mind, and they just happen to run parallel to each other. So the dualism, most people don't agree with dualism right now. Obviously, this entire course is built on the idea that dualism is not correct, that the mind and behavior, mind and the body are the same, that the mind is just the workings of the brain. And one problem with dualism is the mind-body problem, which is the difficulty of explaining how this non-material mind and a material body could interact. And dualists, there are modern dualists, and they've tried to kind of come up with explanations of that, but they're typically not satisfactory. And then later scientists and thinkers included Darwin, who was most famous for his theories of evolution, Mendel, who came up with some basic rules of genetics and how we inherit characteristics. And more recently, a lot of scientists have been very interested in epigenetics. So epigenetics is the observation that genes can be expressed in different ways depending on environmental influences. So depending on maybe if somebody has a genetic predisposition for a certain for obesity, these genes can be turned on or off based on things in the environment. All of these ideas also help us understand that all species are related, and therefore their brain and behavior must be related. So the brain and behavior of more complex species evolved from simpler species. A long time ago, we were a much simpler form of animal. Humans were a much simpler form of animal, and we sort of, as we evolved, we kind of left behind simpler forms of life. And then there's materialism, which is the idea that the brain and the nervous system are enough to explain behavior without having to talk about the mind. So this is the idea that it's not so much that the mind and the brain are the same thing, it's that there's no such thing as the mind and all we have is the brain, and that explains all of behavior. More about the modern brain and behavior perspectives, there's eliminative materialism, which is the idea that there's no need to talk of non-substance mental explanations of behavior if the behavior can be explained wholly by the nervous system. So it's a strong version of materialism within this belief, or within this idea of eliminative materialism. Beliefs and thoughts are just brain processes. So it's something that it's something physical that happens, physical and chemical that happens in the brain. And according to this belief, the more that we know about how the brain works, the less we'll have to depend on these kind of psychological phenomena such as depression, anxiety, things like this. And again, this is a very strong version of materialism. A lot of people have beliefs that are more somewhere along the spectrum of materialism. So most people who study the brain accept some form of materialism, but recognize that since we don't know everything about the brain, we have to use these kind of mental constructs like belief, pain, attention, depression, anxiety, etc.